Welcome to the lecture series of Taiwan Institute for Governance and Communication Research. And my name is Qu Huang. I'm the director of the TIGCR. We have a nickname for ourselves. We call ourselves Tiger. Okay. Today it is our great honor to have Professor Amy Liu教授to give us a talk. Professor Liu received her PhD in political science from Emory University, and she is currently associate professor in government department in the University of Texas at Austin. And her research and teaching focus both on politics of language, the language of politics. And today she is going to give a talk on the topic on attitudinal effects of bilingual and multilingual ballot designs. Okay, and I think this will be extremely interesting topic. So I will just pass the time to Professor Liu, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited today to talk about this project. This is one of my fun projects that brings together my interest in politics and language. I am also the daughter of a designer, and so this is a merging of all these different projects. So we know in a democratic society, there is always a diversity of preferences. And so the question, the challenge in any democracy is how do we accommodate these different preferences? And here we know that institutions matter. Institutions matter, institutional designs matter for accommodating different voices, including ethnic minorities. And so in the literature, there's substantial research focusing on party lists. Should minorities be included, have reserved seats at the top of the party list? Should there be ethnic parties? There's discussions about electoral formulas, single transferable votes, quotas. And then there's also discussion about district magnitudes, which are larger districts more friendly to minorities. But consistent in all these works is the assumption that minority languages will always appear on the ballots, that somehow we will include and accommodate minorities. But there is never any attention or discussion on where on the ballot these minority languages will appear. And so the question I'm looking at today is I'm going to show you a couple different ballot designs, and then we are going to look at the attitudinal effects of these designs. So let me first start with, let's talk about the ballot, why the ballot is so important. It is the single document that marks the voter's preference. We have all this discussion in political science about how do we transfer voter preferences into legislative seats. But we assume that the voter preference, what the voter wants and what the voter actually marks down on the paper is one-to-one, that there's no mistake there. But we know from the literature that bad designs can skew and can actually impede the democratic process. And the best example of this is the 2000 US presidential election from the state of Florida. And this is a ballot that is known as the butterfly design. So what you see is that in the first column or in the first row here is George Bush. And if you wanted to vote for George Bush, you would mark this, you would punch the hole number 3. If you wanted Pat Buchanan for the Reform Party, you punch this hole 4. If you wanted Al Gore, you would, over here, you would punch this hole. And so it goes from left to right to left. And so what happens is that because of this poor design, a lot of voters who wanted to vote for Al Gore saw that he is second in the row below George Bush. So they would punch this hole instead. And what ended up happening is that a lot of Al Gore votes ended up going to Pat Buchanan. And there is substantial research, there's evidence to suggest that Pat Buchanan got a large number of Al Gore votes. And if those votes had actually gone properly to Al Gore would have actually won the presidency. So what we see here is this is not a hypothetical example, that a bad ballot design can actually mess up the democratic process. The US had a president that the majority of the voters did not want. And so we know that bad designs matter or can skew the process. And as a result, we also know from the literature that designs in other ways matter. The candidate name order matters. Being first on the list is better than being last. We also know that the available candidate information matters. Do you want to list their party name, party ID? Do you want to list their age, their gender, their current occupation? Do you want to have the option of letting people just vote based on parties? So instead of choosing between candidates, you choose just for the party. I want all the candidates in this one party. And you check it and all of the boxes get filled. There's also substantial literature discussing the differences between paper versus electronic ballots. But never in this literature is there discussion about the languages on the ballots itself. There's the assumption that minority languages will be translated. They will be translated correctly, and they will appear on the ballots, and that's it. That's enough. So let's talk about the importance of languages. The status of minority language vis-a-vis the majority language is politically important. In the US, there's literature, there's work showing that having Spanish next to English can evoke anti-immigration hostilities among the English speakers. And this is not a US specific example. In Canada, by law, French must come before English, and the French text must be 2 times as large as the English text. This is because of political fights over language. And so the implication here is that the presence, first of all, the presence of a minority language and where it is placed should affect attitudes and can have electoral outcomes. And I'm going to also note that just because the ballot has 2 languages does not mean users of both languages have the same experience when voting. So for example, if English and Spanish are both on the US ballot, a Spanish speaker may feel that they are accommodated. The English speaker may feel annoyed that there is Spanish on the ballot. So I'm going to talk about 3 ballot designs, how we can accommodate different minority languages. The first option is we have multiple monolingual ballots. So each language gets 1 ballot, and you just have multiple monolingual ballots for each one. So let me give you an example of what this would look like in the Taiwan case. So here is an example of the presidential ballot from the 2012 presidential election. And yeah, so this is right. This is all in Chinese. And alternatively, if we wanted to have another language, this is what it would look like. I'm curious if anyone knows what this other language is. What is the other language on this ballot? No guesses. So this is actually Paiwan, Aboriginal language, Paiwan Zhu. And so if you are, so if so what you can do, right, is you can have a ballot in Chinese, a ballot in Ame, a ballot in Paiwan, and a ballot in Paya, for example. And so everyone gets their language on their ballot. But the problem with this type of design, this arrangement, is that even though it may seem equal up front, that everyone has access to a ballot in their language, in their mother tongue, it's actually not equitable for the minority ex post. If you need a Paiwan ballot, it could be because you don't speak Chinese and you need to go get this other language, that ballot in the other language. But how do you communicate that you need this other ballot? Presumably, right, if you're going to ask someone at the polling precinct, I need a Taiwan Yu, the ballot, right? this implies that you have to be able to speak Chinese to already get that. And if someone feels embarrassed to ask for their ballot in their minority language, they may not turn out to vote at all. And so it actually suppresses the second language, the minority language voters. It also, there's an issue of cost, right? Printing a lot of ballots in a lot of languages may not, and if people is very costly, and if voters don't end up using those minority ballots, those in the majority will complain that they spent all this money on minority languages and it wasn't even used. So your second option is to have a bilingual ballot. And it's a single ballot instead of multiple ballots. You have a single ballot, and your one ballot it's divided by columns or it's divided by rows. It depends on your language. And what you do is it's separated. So your languages are separated and you have one language per section. So back to the Taiwan example. Here's an example of where if you have Chinese on the top and you have Taiwan on the bottom. So you can choose if you want to do it on the Chinese ballot, right? Your 圈选栏, right? You just go check it up at the top. If you want to vote in Taiwan, right? You look at the Hahangan and you vote on the bottom. And presumably this would be a bilingual ballot. The challenge with this ballot, however, with this idea is that while it may seem that it's equal, we have an issue here of equality in size versus equality in space. And this has implications also for inferiority and confusion. So let me give you an example of what I mean by equality in font size and equality in space. Let me give you the sentence. I eat breakfast tacos. So breakfast tacos, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a Texas, California, but mostly Texas breakfast item. It is a lot like a Mexican danbing. So there on the left is the breakfast taco. The one on the right is Taiwan danbing. So I eat breakfast tacos is in English. In Spanish, a breakfast taco, I eat breakfast taco is como tacos de desayuno. So these are grammatically the same sentence. They're translated correctly. They are the same font and the same font size. But if you look, and let me put a red box around it, notice that the English sentence is shorter than the Spanish sentence. And in fact, Spanish is about 40% longer than English. Obviously, if we translated I eat breakfast tacos to 吃蛋饼, that's even shorter than I eat breakfast tacos. So if you want to talk about dividing a space up, the challenge is that languages, even when translated correctly, do not take up the same amount of space. So how do you divide this? And so in this case, right now, the Spanish simply takes up more space than English. And there may be issues there may be resentment from the majority English speakers that there is more Spanish than English on the page. So your solution could be to fit everything into the same shape, into the same size. But to do this requires shrinking the Spanish language, the Spanish phrase. And when you shrink the Spanish phrase, this means people who use Spanish will see that their language is smaller. It also may suggest then that their language is of less importance. So let me go back to this example I had earlier. Notice that the Taiwan language simply takes up more space than the Chinese character. It just takes up more space. And so there was, and I don't know if you actually can tell, but actually the bottom half of the ballot is a little larger than 50% than the Chinese half. So Taiwan actually takes up more space on this ballot than Chinese. And this in turn, right, can have implications for how people perceive their language in the relationship. So the third design is we have a single bilingual ballot, but then we collate and we stack all the languages together. We don't divide them, we don't separate them, and we put them all together. So an example, let me show you what that example would look like for a Taiwan ballot. It would be literally putting all the Taiwan language next to Chinese. So you have in the same box, right? 总统候选人 is right next to It's all together in that same box. Everyone checks the same 圈选栏, right? They all pick the same spots, regardless of language. The challenge with this design is that it is certainly more equal, but it means that those in the majority, the Chinese speakers, must constantly see the minority language. They have to see Taiwan in every single box. And this can actually facilitate irritation, if not hostility. And so my hypothesis in this project is that attitudes among those in the majority are most negative when the ballots are bilingual and they're collated and stacked, the third design, where they're all mixed together. So to test this, I'm going to actually use an example from a non-Taiwan case. I'm going to use the Republic of Georgia. There were several reasons why I looked at Georgia. The first was a very practical one. I was in Georgia. I had the chance to run this field experiment, and this is where we went with. I'm going to assume most people here are not familiar with Georgia politics or where Georgia is. So Georgia is 15 and a half hours from Taipei. There's no direct flight from Taipei. You would have to go through Dubai, Istanbul, Amsterdam, Paris, or London to get to places. And but it is in Asia. It's in West Asia, and specifically, it is between the Black Sea. The north is Russia, and the south is Turkey. So it's a tiny little country, about 4 million, so smaller than Xinbei all in one. And the most famous Georgian we know, unfortunately, is Joseph Stalin from the Soviet era. But Georgia itself is a very beautiful country. The picture on the left is Old Town Tbilisi, the capital. And on the right is one of the most famous churches set against Kazbeki Mountain, which is one of the highest mountains in Asia, outside of the Himalayas. So to understand the politics of Georgia, to describe Georgia-Russia relations, the best way to describe this is to think of Georgia-Russia relations is like Ukraine-Russia relations, very much like Taiwan-China relations. There are people who are very vehemently opposed to normalizing relations with Russia. There are people who believe that Russia is a very large neighbor and there are shared connections, shared histories, and they should be normalized. The attitude towards the Russian language is very split. There are people who recognize it as a colonial language. Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. But there are also people who recognize Russian as a very practical language. It is the language of the larger neighbor. It is the language of commercial trade. The number one country for tourists coming to Georgia is from Russia. The number one destination for Georgian men to work abroad is in Russia. And the number one destination for Georgian wine exports is Russia. So there is a very practical commercial element to it. Moreover, I'll show this shortly. Georgia is very diverse with other ethnic groups. And so Russian is actually a lingua franca across the different ethnic groups. The third reason for focusing on Georgia is that Georgian, the language itself, is very unique from Russian and English, and it's written with a very different script. So let me give you an example. And I apologize, all my meta analogies are always about food. So if you have a phrase here in Chinese, 他在公园吃一个 hachapuri. What is a hachapuri? This is a hachapuri. This is a very famous Georgian dish. It's bread with cheese on the bottom with an egg on top. You will eat it. You will be very sick because you are so full, and then you will fall asleep. And then you wake up and you will want more. Okay. So in English, we'd say she ate one hachapuri in the park. And in Georgian, if you look at the grammar, well, this is how you would write it in Georgian. This is how you would pronounce it in Georgian. And this is how the grammar structure is one hachapuri, ate it, park it. And then the Russian, you notice this is the Russian alphabet. That's how you pronounce it. And then grammatically, it says she ate one hachapuri in park. So Georgian is very different in the alphabet, in the grammar. It has no gender. Just very, very different. And so given these differences, I fielded a national representative survey, field experiment, in July 2019 with face-to-face tablets. So let me show you what the design looked like. So again, Georgian-Russian relations are very, very similar to Taiwan-China relations. And I did not want to actually put a candidate. I did not want to use an actual ballot. I was afraid that if I used an actual ballot, people would be voting on the ideology, the position of Russia, and not on the Russian language itself. So what I did was I actually did it as a survey experiment, where I just did it as a survey and I altered the layout of the survey. So what we see in the first design is just a straight monolingual Georgian ballot or Georgian survey design. And you'll see that there's a Georgian question, and then they get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 options. The second is the bilingual separated. So it's the same text, but it's split on a column to the left. And then on the column on the right, this is the Russian. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then they could pick their responses. The third is the bilingual stacked collated. And so notice it's Georgian Russian, and every column, right, every row is Georgian Russian, Georgian Russian. And so if you are a Georgian speaker, you must go through Russian every single time. And so based on these questions, based on these designs, so the treatment is the actual design itself. I have 3 questions of interest. The first was, generally speaking, would you say most people in Georgia can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people, where 0 to 10, where 10 is most people can be trusted. Second is political confidence. There are different opinions regarding the direction in which Georgia's domestic politics are going. Which of the following would you personally agree with? 1 to 5, with 5 going in a direction. The third question is a nativist chauvinist tendency question. Please tell me how much you agree with the following statement. The Russian language should be made another language, official language of Georgia. And so people who say 4 would suggest, someone who answers 4 would suggest they are more nativist, more anti-Russian, more chauvinist. And so here, the base category is people who got the Georgian monolingual design. So what we see is that people who got the Georgian Russian column, so 2 columns, had no difference at all from those who got the Georgian monolingual. So it seems that the presence of the second language, of the Russian language on the right-hand side, had no effect. There's no difference, no statistical significance on trust, confidence, government confidence, or on nativist tendencies. But where we do see a difference is on the collated design, the ones where you have Georgian Russian, Georgian Russian, Georgian Russian stacked on top of each other. We see that people who got the Georgian Russian collated design were less likely to trust the average Georgian, and they were more likely to be opposed to having Russian as a second official language. They were more nativist in their tendencies. So these results suggest a couple things. They raise a couple questions. Actually, they raise 3 questions. The first is whether or not this is a story about foreign languages, or is this a story about Russia itself? And so what I do is I also look at English. So I also have I have 2 more treatments where I do Georgian English column and I do Georgian English stack, Georgian English, Georgian. I also have a question about would they be opposed to having English as a second official language? And there is a lot of debate about whether to have Russian and or English as a second official language. And so if we see anything significant, we see any effect at all for English, this would suggest there is a second language effect. If we don't see anything for English, this would suggest that it is a Russian language. And so here are the results. And it turns out nothing is significant. Amazingly, nothing is significant at all. So this would suggest that it's not about the second language on the ballot that matters, but rather it is something about the Russian language that matters. This is not significant. This is significant. The only one here from before. Having a Georgian Russian collated affects your attitudes about Russian as a second language, makes you more nativist. But having English treatments affects nothing at all. Nothing is significant. So this seems to suggest it is about Russian and not about the second. So the next implication here is the surveys thus far, what I've talked about, the sample so far is about ethnic Georgians themselves, but there are non-ethnic Georgians. And there are two and a half types of non-ethnic Georgians. There are Abkhazians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Ossetians, and Russians. So Abkhazian, let me talk about the first and the fourth, Abkhazian and Ossetians. These are non-ethnic Georgians who live in Georgia, who have demanded independence since 1991. And over the past few decades, they have received a lot of military and financial and diplomatic support from Moscow. And they are both currently occupied by Russian troops. And as the Russian troops have entered these places, there are Abkhazians and Ossetians who have fled those areas and into the rest of Georgia. And according to the UN, these people are not considered refugees because they are still in the same country, but they are certainly displaced. These Abkhazians and Ossetians do not speak Georgian, usually as a first language, but they do speak Russian. Then the second is Armenians and Azerbaijanis. These are refugees from neighboring Armenia and neighboring Azerbaijan. Armenia and Azerbaijan have been at war, and so there are civilian refugees. And again, Armenians, Azerbaijanis don't speak Georgian, but they do speak Russian. And then the Russians obviously speak Russian. So here is a case for a large number of these non-ethnic Georgians. They don't speak Georgian as a first language, but they do all speak Russian. And for them, it's not that they ask that they want Abkhazian or Armenian on the ballot, but they would like Russian on the ballot. They would acknowledge that there is diversity. There's acknowledgement that they don't speak Georgian. And so the prediction is that attitudes among those in the minority groups are most positive when the ballot is bilingual, and it's collated. So that's Georgian, Russian, Georgian, Russian, Georgian, Russian. And the results suggest this is indeed the case, that when it is collated, they are more likely to trust people in Georgia, and they are more likely to be confident in the government. It does not affect their attitudes for Russian or English as a second official language. But what we are seeing here is that something about Russian, the inclusion of Russian, makes them feel more to hold more positive attitudes. And of course, having English has no effect because they don't speak English. The third implication is when we have all these other languages, once we start adding a second, and we will see shortly a third language, the ballot becomes very long, and it can take time to go through the ballot. And if time is money, it's very inefficient. So the question here is there a trade-off between granting minorities their language for equality versus efficiency? And so to test this, I look at the time spent on the survey itself, and the minimum was 59 seconds, and the max was 20 minutes. And the prediction is speed will be the fastest among the majority when the ballots are monolingual. They don't have to look at Russian. And it will be the fastest among the minority when the ballots are bilingual and column, so they can just look down the Russian on the right-hand side. And as it turns out, nothing is significant. So it seems that contrary to the language and politics literature, granting more minorities their languages has no cost, has no individual cost or efficiency for both ethnic Georgians and non-ethnic. And so this brings me to the discussion that we know that a combination of a second language on ballots matter. We see that specifically collated bilingual designs, when it's stacked, right, Georgian, Russian, Georgian, Russian, are the least optimal for general trust, political confidence, and suppressing native tendencies. But this is only the case for the majority. And of course, this raises a couple questions. First, are these results specific to Georgia? And yes, they are, because Georgia is a very unique language. But I'm going to show shortly, no, it's not. And then are these results specific to the Russian language in Georgia? And the answer here is also no, because Russian is not the only language that's associated with a colonizer globally, right? It's a multi-dimensional language. It's a language of the colonizer, it's a language of migrants and refugees, and it's a language of trade. Many languages fill this role. In the US, for example, Spanish as well. And so let me then now return back to the Taiwan case. So in Taiwan, we could think, we think of Taiwan as being multi-vernacular. We recognize Mandarin, we recognize Yunnan and Hakka. All three are written in the traditional characters. So when you go to vote on your ballot, it doesn't matter if you're Hakka or a white citizen, right? You read the same language, you read the same characters, and you vote on the same ballot. But the reality is that we also have 16 Aboriginal languages. And so the example I gave was Taiwan, right? And so earlier we saw the separated with Chinese at the top, Taiwan on the bottom, or stacked together, right, in the same box with Chinese on the top, Taiwan on the bottom. But the reality is that Taiwan is increasingly diverse. It's not that linguistically diverse just because of the Aborigines. It's also increasingly diverse because of the new residents in the Xinzhuangmi. And so here we have Vietnamese, Indonesian, Tagalog, Thai, Khmer, and Burmese. And in fact, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Thai, Khmer, and Burmese are 5 of the languages that the Ministry of Education recognizes as necessary for 母语教育 in schools. So if the Education Ministry is recognizing these 5 languages as necessary for teaching in schools, then they need to also be accommodated on the ballot. So here we have Chinese at the top, Vietnamese on the bottom. For a separated ballot, we want a stacked one. We have Chinese on the top, the Chinese and Vietnamese together. But the reality is that these are not the only 2 languages, right? There are 16 Aboriginal languages. There are 5 Xinzhuangmi languages. And here's an example of what happens when you have separated. At the top, you have Chinese, middle is Taiwan, bottom is Vietnamese. And then if you have it all put together, right, this is what it would look like. And what we see is that very quickly, a multilingual ballot becomes very, very complicated. And, but at the same time, we have to accommodate these different languages if we care, to accommodate minorities. Because if you have a Chinese Taiwan ballot and then a Chinese Vietnamese ballot, a Chinese Vietnamese ballot is not going to help a Taiwan person. And a Taiwan person is not going to be able to, and a Taiwan Chinese ballot will not help a Vietnamese person. And so do we then just put all these languages on the same ballot? Or alternatively, instead of 3 languages, there is also recognition that English is an important language in Taiwan. There's a goal of 2030 bilingual campaign. English is seen as a global commercial language. And so this is what a split, separated ballot would look like versus a stacked. But the challenge here is, even though there is the use of a second language, this is not necessarily the native or the most useful language for the Taiwan speakers or the Vietnamese Xinzhuangmi. And so unless you think that I'm making a big deal about this, this is a screenshot from the Central Election Commission. They have a website here on how to vote. And notice they have it in English, Vietnamese, Indonesian, Tagalog, Khmer, and Thai. It is a page that is in these different languages about what you need to do on election day to go and vote. So it is clearly targeting non-Chinese speakers or non-Chinese readers on how to go vote. But yet when they show up to go vote, the ballot is in Chinese. And so unless you're going to just tell them vote by the number or vote by picture, this is actually, there is a risk. This is a bad design. And there's a risk of a mismatch. And so to test this, there's an ongoing survey right now that I'm fielding right now. It's a conjoint experiment among a nationally representative Taiwan sample of 2,000 respondents. is directly testing which ballot design seems more democratic, which one seems fair, and which one seems less confusing. And the results should be forthcoming next month. And so with that, thank you very much for your attention, for your time, and I look forward to your comments and questions.